What is going on, guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another PS4 video. So in this video, I'm going to be doing a full overview of the Revert method, which is a method to allow you to revert your system software version from a higher firmware down to a lower firmware. Now, it's not a downgrading method because you can't just downgrade your firmware to any version that you want. It works by backing up data from your console while you're on your current firmware. And then what you can do is you can update to a higher firmware and then restore your backed up data to then be able to revert back to the firmware that you were on when you took the backup. That's how this process works. And it's a pretty complicated method, so I doubt that many people are actually going to attempt this because you can definitely end up bricking your console if you don't do it correctly. And I was not able to complete this method successfully myself because there's some weird issue that nobody seems to know what's going on with mine and why it wasn't successful in my case. But I'll cover that at the end of the video once we get the whole overview out of the way. But obviously, if it was successful for me, I would have done a full tutorial. So that's why I'm doing this kind of overview video rather than a full in-depth step-by-step guide. But obviously, there are a lot of benefits if you do plan on actually attempting this, because if you're on a jailbreakable firmware on your PS4, then you can back up the data from your jailbreakable firmware, let's say 7.55, and then you can update to a higher firmware like 8.50 to play online and play on PSN and access the latest games. And then you can go ahead and revert back down to 7.55 again when you want to get back onto the jailbreak. So that's a pretty awesome feature. And even if you're not on a jailbroken PS4, because this does work on non-jailbreakable PS4s as well, then on a non-jailbreakable PS4, you could be on 8.50 firmware. You could back up the data from your console while you're on 8.50 and then continue to update to the latest firmware every time a new update comes out from PSN. And then, let's say in a year's time, you're on, say, 9.50 or something, and a jailbreak comes out for 8.50, then you can then revert back down to 8.50 and get access to that new jailbreak. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits for people who are actually, able to do this. But obviously, like I say, it's not a very simple, straightforward process. So anyway, let's get into this. But first, this video is brought to you by the Ridge Wallet. The Ridge Wallet is a compact wallet designed with RFID blocking plates that can hold up to 12 cards with room for cash. I've been daily driving the black aluminium Ridge Wallet for over a year now since my initial sponsor spot for this, and honestly guys, it's a great product. It helps cut down on that awful wallet bulge you get with traditional wallet designs that are far too big and bulky. They also come in over 30 different colors and styles, including some more premium designs like this awesome burnt titanium look that I'm going to be switching to from now on. The Ridge also makes a perfect gift for Father's Day, which is coming up soon, so if you haven't picked out a Father's Day gift yet, I highly recommend you check out the Ridge. They've got their own Father's Day guide on the website that can help you pick out the perfect Father's Day gift. So check the link in the pinned comment below and use code MODDED at the checkout to get a 10% discount. So thanks to Ridge for supporting the channel. In order to pull this off, what you need is 3 pieces of information from your console, 3 pieces of data, I guess you could say, from your console backed up. So let's say we're on 5.05 firmware, just hypothetically, right? We're on 5.05 firmware and we want to do this revert method. We want to back up the data from our system so that we'll then be able to update to 8.50, use the internet, use PSN, go online, play online, all of that stuff. And then maybe after a few weeks of being online on 8.50, we want to then go back to 5.05 to get access to the jailbreak again. So in order to do this, what you would need to do is you need to back up 3 pieces of data from your PS4. The first thing is you need to create an image of your PS4's hard drive. That's fairly simple to do. You just take the hard drive out of your PS4, hook it up to the computer via SATA or SATA to USB adapter, and you can, use some software on the computer, any kind of drive cloning software on the computer can create an image of your hard drive. You just need to make sure you have enough space available on your computer's hard drive to fit the whole, capacity of the PS4's hard drive on your computer. So as long as you have enough storage space, it's a fairly simple thing to do. So that's the first thing you need. The second thing you need is a backup of your S/0, which is the kind of firmware on your NOR chip for the PS4. Now, the good thing is if you're on a jailbroken PS4, this is also very easy to get. All you need to do is use an FTP payload on your PS4 to connect to your PS4 via FTP on your computer. And then you can just go into the dev folder on the root of your PS4's hard drive And inside the dev folder, there will be the s/0 file right there that you can go ahead and back up and just copy it to your computer. And now you have a backup of your s/0. Now, the revert method can be done on non-jailbroken PS4s as well. So in order to back up the s/0 on a non-jailbreakable PS4, it's a lot more complicated, because what you have to do is you have to physically remove the NOR chip from the motherboard. So you have to heat up the chip, remove it from the motherboard. Obviously, that means opening up the whole system up to the motherboard, removing that chip from the board. And then in order to read the data off it, what you can do is you can hook it up to a Teensy 2.0++ or 4.0, and you can read the data that way. I'm not 100% sure on exactly how you read the data off it with a Teensy, because there's not that much information about it. But the other way to do it is to use the E4 flasher, which is currently in beta. It's not publicly available yet. And apparently Lightning Mods is working on a newer version with potentially more features to make this whole process easier. So this version definitely doesn't represent the final product. But the E4 flasher by Lightning Mods or Dark Software LLC, now that device does have pads on the circuit board for the two different types of NOR chips that the PS4 has. It's got the one for the older NOR chips and the one for the newer NOR chips. So you basically just take that NOR chip that you've taken off the motherboard and you solder it onto the pad on the E4 flasher. Once that's done, you're then able to read and write to that chip once it's on the E4 flasher by essentially getting a micro SD card with the INI file, the settings file on it that's set to read the flash file from the chip. You essentially just plug that micro SD card into the E4 flasher and then apply power to the E4 flasher via USB, and then it should dump the contents of the chip, the s/0, onto that micro SD card, and then you can connect that micro SD card up to the computer and back up that s/flash to your computer. So that's how you back it up with a non-jailbroken PS4, and of course once you've done that, you'll then have to remove the chip from the E4 flasher and solder it back on to the PS4 motherboard and make sure that the PS4 is able to boot and that everything is soldered correctly once it boots successfully. And then you are good to go. You've backed up that piece of data. So obviously on a jailbroken PS4, it's much, much easier. You just use FTP, you copy the file from FTP to your computer, you're all good. On a non-jailbroken PS4, physically remove the chip, put it on an E4 flasher, read the data that way, and then put it back on the PS4 motherboard. So that's what you have to do there. So once you have your s/0 backed up and your hard drive image, the last thing you need is the most complicated thing to back up, which is the syscon, so your syscon chip on the PS4 motherboard. The syscon chip is either a 100-pin chip or a 64-pin chip on the newer model PS4s. It can be quite tricky to get it off the motherboard, but again, you have to, get that chip off the PS4 motherboard. And you essentially need to solder it to a breakout board, which just makes it easier to solder wires to the individual pins of the chip. And once you have it soldered onto the breakout board, you have to wire it up as per the diagram, the sysglitch diagram from Wildcard. And this is the way that we actually, get the data off the chip, is we essentially use this sysglitch method, which is kind of a power glitch method to glitch the chip to force it to output its source code to the kind of debug out port on the chip, which is the kind of TX point on the chip, the transmission point. So the reason that we have to do this is that the chip has read and write protection enabled after it gets initially programmed. So you can't just read and write to the chip normally. You have to do this kind of power glitch method, this sysglitch method, in order to get the data off the chip. And can be a little tricky to kind of wire it all up. Essentially, you need three things. You need the breakout board with the chip on it. You need the Teensy 2.0++ or 4.0 programmed with the sysglitch to perform the glitch. And you're also going to need a TTL adapter, like a USB to UART bridge. And you're going to need that to actually capture the output from the chip. So the actual source code that's spewed out to that COM port. And you need to wire it up as per this sysglitch diagram that's right here. You're also going to need a 4 kilo ohm resistor and a diode as well. So once you have it all wired up, as you can see here from the actual diagram that's on screen, you then need to obviously apply power to the Teensy and also hook up the USB to UART bridge to the computer. So at that point, all you have to do is, open up a program like RealTerm, which can capture the output from the COM port and capture it to a file. and you're essentially just going to, leave it for 5 minutes to capture all the output as the glitch is working and it's spewing out its source code on that COM port. You just listen to that COM port and you capture all the data coming through that COM port for a good 5 minutes or so, which should take about 5 dumps of the syscon. And once you've done that, you can then stop it and throw it into a hex editor and trim the file down to the actual syscon so you get the correct start point and end point of the syscon file. And you do that with each dump that you took and then compare them to make sure they're identical. And if all of them are identical, then you have good dumps of your syscon. So at that point, you can then keep that in another backup folder on your computer, and you now have a backup of all 3 pieces of information. You've got your syscon backed up, you've got your S/0 backed up, and you have an image of your PS4's hard drive backed up. Then you are good to go. All you have to do then, obviously, is take that syscon chip and solder it back onto the PS4 motherboard. And as long as the console boots back up again, then you are good to go. So you have successfully backed up the data for the revert method, and you can then safely update your PS4 to the latest firmware, knowing that you should be able to revert back down to 5.05 again using that backed up data. So that's essentially how the backup process works. So let's say you then update to 8.50. You've been using the PS4 on 8.50 for a few weeks. You've been, playing on PSN, all of that stuff. Now you're bored. You want to go back to the jailbroken PS4 again, and you want to do the revert method. You want to downgrade back down to 5.05. So in that case, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to, first of all, get your hard drive, obviously, and either take an image of the hard drive from 8.50 and back that up. Because obviously, if you've been making save games and stuff, you're not going to want to lose all of that stuff. So you probably want to take another image of your hard drive when it was on 8.50, or use 2 hard drives, 2 laptop hard drives, one for 8.50, the latest firmware, and another one for your jailbroken firmware. So you're going to want to basically restore your 5.05 image from the hard drive onto whichever hard drive you're going to use on that PS4, and then plug that back into the PS4. So now the hard drive is set up for 5.05. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and obviously get your S/0 and restore the data for the S/0, which even on a jailbroken PS4, even though you probably won't be on a jailbroken PS4 now if you're on 8.50, but even on a jailbroken PS4, even though we were able to read the S/0 through FTP, you can't write the S/0 in an easy way on a jailbroken PS4. It has to be done the same way as on a retail, which means when you're restoring the S/0, you are going to have to remove the chip from the motherboard, hook it up to your Teensy or your, E4 flasher, and use the INI on the E4 flasher to write to the chip. And obviously you just put on the micro SD card, you put the S/0 backup on there, and obviously the ini file with the setting telling the E4 flasher to flash the chip. And you basically hook it up like that, apply power to the E4 flasher, and it should write your S/0 back onto the chip. Once that's done, you can take that chip off, put it back on the PS4 motherboard, and now your S/0 is back down to 5.05. Then you have your syscon chip, which, again, even more complicated as usual with the syscon chip, because as I said before, the syscon chip is not designed to be written to or read from. So we use the sysglitch method to actually back up the data from the chip, because you can't just read it, but you can't write to it either. And there's no kind of sysglitch method that allows you to write the data to the chip. So unfortunately, there's no way of actually writing the data to the syscon chip. So what you need to do is basically remove that chip, remove the syscon chip from the PS4 motherboard, and you basically need to buy a replacement chip, a blank version of the same type of chip, which I believe for the 100 pin chips, it's an R5F100 PLA chip that you need. And for the newer model PS4s, the Slims and the Pros, it's generally an R5F100 LLA chip, which is the 64-pin version of the syscon chip. You need to order one of those. You can get them from places like DigiKey, where you can order a bunch of them. You can bulk buy as much as you want, really. They're not very expensive. So essentially, once you get one of those chips, you can then program your backup syscon onto one of those blank chips, and then solder that chip back onto the PS4 motherboard. And in order to write the data to the chip, by the way, you can either use an E2 Lite, which is like a, flashing utility for those chips that you can buy for around $60 or so, I think it costs. Or there's also a way to do it via UART as well. So, if you can get that working, you can do it through UART, which is going to be a lot cheaper. But once you write the data to that chip, you can then solder it back onto the PS4 motherboard. And now your Syscon and your S-Flash 0 and your hard drive are all set up for 5.05. So once you have all three of those things in place on the PS4, you're then able to essentially just download the 5.05 firmware online, put it on a USB drive in the normal way that you normally do it when you're updating your firmware. Plug that USB into the PS4, turn it on. It should boot you into safe mode because it's not going to know what the hell is going on. And then you essentially just from safe mode go to update your system software version. It should come up and say, that you have to insert an update of 5.05 or higher instead of, like 8.50 or higher. So it will let you install that older firmware. And then once that firmware is installed, you should be able to boot back into the PS4 OS and you'll be back down to 5.05 firmware in our example here. So that is essentially how the whole method works. Okay, so that's the general overview, but what went wrong with my console when I tried to do this? So basically I backed everything up. I got to that stage. I got the Syscon backed up successfully. But when I was removing the Syscon chip from the motherboard, I did bend some of the pins. And when I was trying to bend them back into place for putting the chip back on the motherboard after backing up the Syscon, one of the pins broke off, which wasn't one of the ones used to read the data off the chip. And I had already read the data from the chip at that point. So it wasn't too big of a deal because I had the blank chips from DigiKey, the R5F100 PLAs. So I went ahead and, wrote my backup Syscon onto that chip and then soldered that onto the motherboard instead, which is what I would be doing anyway if I was reverting back to an older firmware. I'd have to do that anyway. I'm just doing that a bit earlier to, use that chip instead of the original one. So that's what I did, but unfortunately, it's not booting up at the moment. It's just getting like a blue pulsing LED, and it never goes to a white LED, which is what happens when it boots successfully. So it's just pulsing blue all the time, and I'm not sure why that's happening. It's not the soldering, I don't believe, because I checked every single pin and made sure there was no bridges. Plus, the console wouldn't even turn on if there was bad soldering on the pins. So it is turning on. It's not like switching off at any point. It's just pulsing blue LED all the time. So yeah, I'm not sure. There's two things that I can think of that could potentially be causing this. Either one of them is that there's something called the SNVS and NVS. These are kind of data that's inside the Syscon. You can basically throw your Syscon into a program that outputs the SNVS and NVS. And when I do that, my SNVS and NVS are all set to 0xFF. There's no valid data inside them, which is weird because there should be, Wildcard's dumps and Centrino's dumps. Their SNVS and NVS have valid data in them and they work. They're able to do the revert successfully with the blank chip. But in my case, I'm getting this issue and my SNVS and NVS are set to 0xFF. Plus another person I know who was also trying to do this has the same thing where one of his SNVS or NVS, one of them has data in them, the other one doesn't. So, and he's having the same exact problem, pulsing blue light, and the console does not boot up. So that could be the issue. The problem is, why did that happen? Nobody seems to know. I backed up the Syscon successfully. I took like 12 dumps and compared them all, and they're all identical. So clearly, there's nothing wrong with the backup process. So why would the SNVS and NVS be 0xFF? I have no idea. Is that even the problem, or is it completely unrelated? The other thing is that it could be the chips from DigiKey, the R5F100 PLAs, because the other person who has the same issue as me also got the chips from the same place as I did. So they could be bad chips, or it's a subtle difference in the chips. Maybe not all of the R5F100 PLAs are created equal. I believe Wildcard and Centrino got them from somewhere else, the chips. So maybe it's something to do with that. Maybe those chips are just not quite right, even though they are still, R5F100 PLA chips, which should be fine, but maybe there's some subtle difference in those chips from DigiKey that make them not work. That could also be the problem. So I'm not quite sure at the moment, but that's where I stand right now, and that's why I've not been able to kind of go any further with this method. So yeah, that's the issue that I have right now. Anyway, I thought I would do a general overview for you guys because I recorded all this footage as I was going through the process, and it would be a shame to not use it. So hopefully you guys, hopefully this overview, although it wasn't 100% in depth, hopefully it is a good kind of starting point for understanding the method of how the revert method works, and that it's definitely not as simple as using some software on the computer that can just magically downgrade your firmware. So obviously the real method is a lot more complicated than that. So anyway, that's it for this video, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.